Hi, everyone. This is Jim Siegel. I'm coming from you from the National Conservation Training Center in Shepherdstown, West Virginia. And if you're here for the Climate Adaptation for Forest-Dependent Wildlife webinar series, you're in the right place. And first of all, I just want to tell you that, that you can change your audio settings at the bottom. There's a number of different choices that you have. We're going to be hearing from Dr. Olivia LeDee from the U.S. Geological Survey, who will talk about climate change impacts on wildlife. Next slide, please. This webinar series is a partnership between the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Forest Ecology Working Group, our Science Applications and Migratory Bird Programs, and the National Conservation Training Center, which is in Shepherdstown. We're joined by the USDA Forest Service and the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science in sponsoring this webinar series. If you have any questions about the Forest Ecology Working Group of the Fish and Wildlife Service, you can contact Jeff Horan or any technical issues. Please contact me at the below address. And I'm also the person who's going to be helping you get CEU credits through the Society of American Foresters. And so if you contact me after the webinar, I can send you a certificate. The Wildlife Society certification is a self-reported process, and you don't need to contact me about that. This webinar series is for educational purposes only. The views, opinions, or positions expressed in this series are those of the guest presenter and do not necessarily reflect the views, opinions, or positions of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or the Department of Interior. Some of the materials and images may be protected by copyright or may have been licensed to us by a third party and are restricted in their use. Mention of any product names, any companies, web links, textbooks, or other reference materials does not imply federal endorsement. This webinar is being recorded live, and we're going to be using the chat function to ask questions. So don't use your Q&A, but do use the chat function. And this webinar is being recorded and will be posted on a NIACS website, where you can view any of the 13 climate adaptation webinars that we're going to be offering over the next year. The chat function is on your bottom bar, and please, when you type in your question, select the choice Everyone in the drop-down menu and press Submit, and your question will be posted to everyone. I'm going to turn this over to Jeff Horan, and he's going to tell you about the entire series.
Good afternoon, everyone. Again, my name is Jeff Horan. I'm with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and I'm a forest ecologist in our northern region, and I'm also a founding member of the Forest Ecology Working Group, which has been putting together these series. And so thanks again for joining us, and we really appreciate all the folks that have been joining us throughout these events. And as you know, the last couple series, we try to tell a story. So this particular Climate Adaptation for Forest-Dependent Wildlife series is, again, a 12-part series, and it tells a story about climate change and its impacts on forest ecosystems and forest-dependent wildlife species. And today's presentation of climate change impacts on wildlife is, right in the sweet spot of that. And Olivia is really going to set things up for the discussions that follow. So again, we're going to examine forest ecosystems, and we're going to provide you guys some tools that we think are going to help you in the professional work that you do. So today, again, it's climate change impacts on wildlife, and it's going to be a presentation by Dr. Olivia LeDee with U.S. Geological Survey. And I'm going to introduce Olivia in just a minute, and folks will notice that Olivia was supposed to be our second webinar in our 12-part series, but because of events beyond any of our control, she's now our third webinar, but it still fits in just perfectly. So, but I will say, I will invite folks to join us on July 19th when we're back to our regular webinar series, which is the third Tuesday of each month. And we're going to begin, we're going to get away from the, setting things up, and we're going to talk about disturbance ecology and disturbance regimes. And it's going to be synergistic effects of multiple stressors on forest resistance, resilience, and response. And the presenter will be Dr. Sam Cushman, who's with the USDA Forest Service at the Rocky Mountain Research Station. And he's just getting back from a long trip in Africa. So with that, let's introduce Olivia. So Dr. Olivia LeDee is the acting federal director of the Midwest Climate Adaptation Science Center. She has a BS in biology. She also has an MS and a PhD in conservation biology, both from the University of Minnesota. And her focus tends to be working with partners and researchers and natural resource managers to understand emerging conservation challenges and prepare us all for climate change. So with that, please welcome Dr. Olivia LeDee. Take it away, Olivia. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jeff. Thank you to NCTC and NIAX for the invitation. Really appreciate being here. This is a great opportunity to step back and take a moment and think about what we have learned on the impacts of climate change on wildlife. I will give a couple of caveats. I'm going to focus primarily on terrestrial wildlife. That alone is a large enough challenge, so won't talk about fish as much, but a lot of what I will talk about sort of are general principles. And I know we have a mixed audience with folks with different expertise, mostly, forest and wildlife biologists. But again, this is setting the stage. But I hope that this is not, that you will see new things, even though we're going to be talking about distribution or phenology, which might be familiar concepts in terms of climate change, that we're going to talk about where we are going. So again, thank you for the opportunity, a great opportunity to reflect. And please, I encourage you to put questions in the chat and open this up for dialogue. So before we go too far, I just want to sort of remind us of some fundamentals on climate change and how it affects natural resources and ecosystems. And then generally for each topic, I'm going to talk about what have we learned over the past 20, 30 years, what might be new for the past couple of years, and then where I think we might be going in terms of research and understanding. And I won't talk very much about adaptation or at all. That's a whole nother talk, but I will leave you with a small positive note in terms of adaptation and adaptive capacity. So we really are focusing on the impacts of climate change on wildlife, and particularly terrestrial wildlife today. So you've probably heard climate, so temperature and moisture are the master limiting factors of life on Earth. So that abiotic component that we are tinkering with climate change. There are also biotic interactions, so interspecific interaction, disease dynamics, resource availability that also determine the distribution of wildlife on the planet. And then we add in the layer of anthropogenic activities, be it fragmentation, disturbance, altered land use. These three things intersect to determine the distribution and abundance. So we can't just look at temperature and moisture alone. We also have to think about those changing biotic interactions and the changing human landscape to understand what the future distribution is. So this is one of the fundamentals. Again, a lot of times we think about the direct effects of climate change on wildlife. We think about thermal stress, we think about drought or moisture stress or flooding, but we don't think about those indirect effects. We don't think about how it alters the quality of habitat or how it alters the prevalence of new diseases on the landscape. And so really try to hit that home that sometimes it's easier to conceptualize those direct effects, and that's why we talk about them more, but it's probably those indirect effects that are likely really having a large impact on survival, reproduction, all of those vital rates. Also, vulnerability is context dependent. So you've probably seen this where it's the intersection of exposure. So how much climate the system is exposed to, how sensitive that system is, and what's the inherent adaptive capacity. These things depend on, exposure depends very much on local, including microclimate conditions. Sensitivity depends on not only the species, but the population. And also on the organismal level. Same is true for adaptive capacity. So although one species might be vulnerable in one region of the country, that is not necessarily true in another region of the country because patterns of climate change vary, those populations and their genetic structures vary, including their behavioral adaptive capacity, let alone others. So, and another thing we don't talk about as much is that some species are responding favorably to climate change. But it's important to realize that we anticipate predominantly negative consequences for biodiversity. And so I think this is a great illustration of, right, we have a large pool of diversity of generalist and specialist species, high richness on the landscape. And as you go through increasing disturbance, so you add climate change, you add land conversion, et cetera, invasive species, we are moving communities to become more homogenized. So global homogenization of biodiversity. So those unique places no longer are unique because the organisms that have the capacity to adapt to these changing conditions to high disturbance are going to continue to expand their range and outcompete those specialists. Climate effects are multi-scale. Again, I'm setting up for how complicated it is, the effects of climate change on wildlife. So, right, we're seeing impacts at the individual level, varying impacts or effects at subpopulation species, and then that trickles all the way up to community dynamic changes and ecosystem level changes. So just a reminder that we're also operating in multiple temporal scales too. Just a good reminder. And then setting us up for going into the conversation, the changes are underway and they are widespread. This was a review from 2016 of global changes in biodiversity. And I'm going to center around the categories that they use. So changes in morphology, changes in genetics, physiology, community dynamics, phenology, interspecific relationships, and distribution. I'm going to set productivity aside because that's great for our marine fisheries crew. But from their study, most ecosystems have been affected, if not all ecosystems have been affected by climate change. So starting with phenology, right? This is something that we've heard a lot about from the get-go. We have decades of documented effects of climate change on wildlife. So this was one of the first inherent, it's because we were looking at birds, right? I mean, everything from Christmas bird count to breeding bird surveys, we've been tracking birds. They're easy to track for a long time. Also butterflies, it's been known for a while. Species level variation is apparent, right? Some are responding. They have different cues than others. Some are photoperiod, some are temperature. Only more recently are we seeing this apply to amphibians, mammals, and then even more recently, reptiles. But phenology, we've seen that for quite a long time. So we've gone to, that's the shack, Leopold Shack, where we've gone from local expert-led, handwritten logs of arrival dates for butterflies and birds to, right, eBird and others where you can turn your phone on and it can listen to the birds and tell you what you hear. So I think that is where we are going in terms of tracking, and many great publications are coming out of the work of eBird, where we are collecting large amounts of data from the general public that can inform what we now understand about the distribution of wildlife under climate change, again, particularly for birds. Thinking about distribution, this is another one where we have decades of work looking at changes for distribution of organisms. And then you'll also see the same taxonomic bias that we tend to see, right? Birds, butterflies, mammals. And again, species level variation is apparent, like where we're talking about whether things are generalists versus specialists. Early on, there was this focus on things moving northward or poleward and shifts to higher elevation. And generally that does tend to be the case, but it is not as straightforward. You can see shifts that are not necessarily that direction because they're taking advantage of moisture or habitat conditions that have been driven by climate change. And then, so early on, right, we're seeing changes in phenology. It's documenting this change. It's documenting a change in its distribution. And so then eventually around 2008, maybe a little bit before, we start talking about barriers to these range shifts and really concentrating on land conversion, and that there are barriers and that assisted colonization will really be important for us to facilitate the movement of organisms that would not be able to. So that sort of dominated that conversation. And then now we're talking about neonatives. So things that are able to shift their distribution. They weren't typically present in this range. It's new. They may or may not have detrimental impacts on the ecosystem, and we don't necessarily know how to respond to them. So that's an area of conversation right now. So whereas in the past, again, we were documenting the effects of climate change. So how has climate change affected the distribution? And we were doing that by doing resurveys like the Grinnell resurvey and others. We had decades of research going back. Let's repeat that. To now, let's look at widespread shifts in distribution and how that is causing social and economic implications. Everything from hospitalizations because you have expanding disease or venomous organisms to arachnids as the example, to damage to crops and agriculture. So, and this is a study from 2019. So really trying to expand our understanding of these range shifts and then what are they doing holistically beyond just having a new organism in the range. One of the other things that I wanted to do was I wanted to reflect, because I'm helping to contribute to the National Climate Assessment for the Midwest chapter, and I wanted to reflect and see what did we say about how climate change was affecting ecosystems or species or fish and wildlife in the past, and how has that evolved over time? And so this was a really interesting exercise. So going back to 2001 for the first National Climate Assessment, like we know very little. Right, you've sort of seen a little bit of what I showed on phenology and distribution. We knew that ahead of time. Ecosystem was not picked as a major topic, so it was overlooked. And then again, we're talking about shifting range, human and geographic barriers, invasive or non-native species, and that we expect losses. That's about all you get. I mean, I pretty much pulled out everything that was relevant. So then again, we're going to continue to accumulate information. So habitat, and one slide on the effects of climate change on habitat is not enough. But this is, I'm going to just give you a taste again throughout this whole talk. We really focused on coastal systems, montane systems, and tundra systems, right? Where it's obvious sea level rise, changing ice availability, permafrost thaw, these are all affecting these systems. What was really interesting is that there was a lot of paleoecology work, so going back thousands of years to see how changes in climate altered vegetation composition. And so that was really important contribution to where we are in terms of ecological understanding of climate impacts on habitat for wildlife. There was early work talking about we won't see communities that ever existed in the past, right? They're going to be novel, no analog communities, never existed before, and we're going to have some surprises. Eventually, folks start merging habitat and demographic models, so looking at those changes, be it in sea ice availability and how that then affects population dynamics of penguins, for example. And then recognizing there's a role for microclimate, right? There's global climate, there's regional climate, and then organisms are selecting habitat based on local conditions, be it access to water, be it shading, and that's really important for mediating stress. And then more recently, we're getting into process models, so much more detailed models of vegetation change, and pairing those with much more detailed mechanistic models of vital rates, again, and for wildlife, which is a great, again, linking up the mechanisms of change make it more likely we're going to get better estimates of what to expect. So whereas, the early teens, we were thinking about correlative models, just looking at where did this plant occur in the past relative to temperature and moisture? Where do we see that pattern? Where do we project that pattern to exist in the future? And that's where we think it could exist, but not necessarily will exist, right? Because of those other barriers that determine distribution of life on the landscape. And now more recently, right, recognizing that land use is so important in what we can do. And so pairing land use and climate models together. And so there's been quite a bit of work. So looking at how it's affecting forest productivity and then moving that forward several steps to look at what it might look in 100 or 200 years. So moving to the second National Climate Assessment, ecosystems is a sector. So it increased in prominence. Again, deserts, coastal, Arctic systems. So really where, for lack of a better term, effects of climate change are obvious. That's where we continue to focus our efforts. We're talking about range shifts again, that they have occurred, likely to continue. And then a focus on trout, mountain species, again, sort of things with a clear thermal link to the direct effects of climate change. That's where we continue to focus. Again, I pulled out most of what was there. There's probably a little bit more, but most of what was there. So where we start to get really interesting are interspecific interactions, right? So starting to pull out those interesting relationships between species. So phenological mismatch, I think we heard about pretty early, again, for birds and butterflies, great hit. And some of the butterflies out of the UK. It's been linked to population declines since like the teens, like pretty early in terms of the climate effect, linked to increased predation, very concerned about disease dynamics being driven by climate change. You can think about everything from fungal disease for amphibians and snakes to others like EHD, epizootic hemorrhagic disease for deer. And we now have local extirpations that have been documented. So extreme weather, phenological mismatch, and loss of the Carner blue butterfly at a location in Indiana. And so again, it's right, you're having to tie up, knowing the tight relationship between lupin and the Carner blue, documenting the extreme weather events and also documenting the mismatch. So when we can pull these stories together, they depend on long-term data and really high understanding of the system. And hopefully we can use this understanding to then apply it to other systems as well. So there's that great tit study where we're looking at sort of the synchrony between prey availability and reproductive activity for a bird to that asynchrony, and then reduce reproductive success. And again, less of an issue for some, to a really interesting study on where I think we're going is plasticity, the ability of organisms to respond and take advantage of new conditions. And so this was a study of ring seals and white whales and how much time they shift, how they shift their activity based on prey availability. With ring seals continuing to try and access their prey that is no longer available at the extent of sea ice where they are, and white whales changing their behavior, changing the amount of time that they spend on the glacial fronts and taking advantage of a new food resource, right? So some organisms showing plasticity, some not. And again, I think this is where we're going to be going because we now know if we add this in, it really improves our understanding of extinction projections or outcomes for species going forward. Shifting to physiology, there was a really early focus on climate envelope and niche models. Again, sort of like those temperature, precipitation, or temperature and moisture conditions that are optimal for particular organisms, and really focused on ectotherms. So early work on tropical insects. But really noting that if we don't understand the mechanisms, their physiology, that's the limiting factor. We really don't understand. A lot of this work has been experimental. So it's butterflies and other small organisms. So where is their stress? Where do they exhibit some plasticity? And then now we seem to be shifting a little bit more to endotherms, field studies, and then bringing up the multi-scale to those community level effects of impacts on physiology. So where we were going for those species distribution models, I think we are more going to be appreciating those interspecific physiological differences. So this is a study, I think it was of bees across the world, and looking at sort of how much variability they have in their tolerance of heat stress. And again, as I said, subpopulation variability. So again, really important. There's no necessarily one size fits all. This was one that I got to learn a little bit more about in pulling this together, because I don't spend as much time on morphology. It's a little bit less connected to conservation outcomes than perhaps some of these other things, but a lot of the morphological work has been on endotherms, and you have probably, it's about size. Nearly everything is about shrinking body size, right, as an ecological response to climate change based on fundamental thermodynamic understanding. So really one of the first papers was before 2009 on a long-term work on wild sheep. Then we've also seen it associated with smaller body size and shorter lifespans in moose at their southern range limit. And then what's interesting is now sort of changing sizes of the appendages, which again has to do with sort of thermoregulation properties in response to climatic warming. And again, that's 2021. So really seeing, moving from size to also looking at color and other features. So whereas we're like, okay, we're getting smaller top predators, smaller consumers. We are seeing changing colors in dragonflies and other organisms based on temperature conditions, or we're seeing changes in their features. So again, really interesting. This is one where I learned a lot and was fascinated by it. Okay, moving to the third national climate assessment. So we're getting in more. I promise there's more than I'm showing you here. So here's where I'm starting to have to edit and not include everything, because we are starting to capture more of the changes, right? Iconic species may disappear from regions, right? We talked about Carner blue butterfly. The mix of plant and animal life will become almost unrecognizable. Remember, I said non-analog communities. They never existed before. And then we're talking about phenology. Spring migrations has shifted and leading to important impacts on species and their habitats. So again, a little bit more similar. I promise you'll see a difference in the fourth National Climate Assessment coming up here. One of my favorite areas to work is in population dynamics. I think it's just an interest of mine. Our early work on linking climate to population dynamics is really at a core scale. It's where you had 20, 30 years of information on vital rates, survival, reproduction. And it was often tied to El Nino, La Nina, North Atlantic oscillation. not really focused on the mechanism of sort of why this link is there. And focused on, okay, there's a little bit rainier, colder conditions during nesting. And so we think that's the reason why we're seeing this reduction in reproductive success. So focused on the direct effects, didn't really think about how we change habitat and how that affects nutrient quality and reproduction. But we have seen changes in sex ratio. We see changes in survival by age class. We've had one extinction, more or less unequivocally linked to climate change of the mammal. And then it's likely true for some amphibians in Costa Rica and others, but there's a little bit more debate around those, again, because the story is a little bit more difficult to tell when it's direct and indirect effects over a large period of time. So where do I think we are going, right? We're going from those really core scale, let's look at NAO and its effects on behavior, activity, or reproduction for caribou, to let's look at, the effects of climate change on tick load and how that affects body fat and how that affects the ability to deliver and have offspring survive. Again, really getting at the details. And so that's a variation of low versus high tick loads versus how much fat they're carrying. Again, where we're learning quite a bit in moose. And then shifting to genetics, there was early concern about, right, rear edge populations being really important for genetic diversity. And relatively quickly shifting to range expansion and the concern for reduced genetic diversity and perhaps hybridization. We've also seen where populations that were genetically compromised because of, let's say, habitat fragmentation or barriers to facilitating metapopulation dynamics, we see increased susceptibility to the effects of climate change. This conversation has shifted quite a bit over the years. Talk about preservation and evolutionary rescue to rewilding, especially preservation in terms of plant systems, a little bit less so in the wildlife system. And then more recently focusing on adaptive genetic variation. So how much variability is there genetically across the population and how much of that is conferring additional capacity to adapt to the effects of climate change. There's also quite a bit of active debate on how much should we be concerned about genetic diversity either being reduced or increased, and whether or not we know enough. I think some interesting things here, right? We're going from documenting, this is when we're documenting rapid evolution. I think this was a hare, right? Where over a few generations, their breeding time changed very rapidly, and that was tied to changing climatic conditions, to moving to the contentious area for some of directing evolution, where there is selective breeding. This is for coral, where there's active conversation of let's use selective breeding to place organisms that are more tolerant of thermal stress, are able to coexist with these stress tolerant symbionts. So really interesting, right? Area where some folks in some systems are going is effectively directing evolution. Okay, so now we're at the 4th National Climate Assessment, where we see shifts in behavior, physiology, physical characteristics across a range of species. We've documented evolutionary changes. Phenological change varies across trophic levels, so we see that mismatch. It's led to range contractions, so we know specifically more about the distribution changes. There's species level variability. And again, we're seeing those novel species interactions, novel ecosystems, and again, really important arena for us to learn more about. There's a lot more behind this, but this was, trying to pull out the high points. So documenting that we know more. And then just shifting a bit, right? So, I think for some folks, it's overwhelming. My charge today was really to talk about the effects of climate change on wildlife. And if for some, it's like, okay, we're seeing extinction, we're seeing range shift. There's not much we can do. And so didn't want to leave you there, even though that's where, that's the focus of this talk. And really, I don't know that we know who this quote's attributed to, but right, that the best way to predict your future is to create it. And one, these organisms are taking care of that to some extent for themselves, where they are demonstrating adaptive capacity, where they can cope with or adjust to those changes, right? So we have all of these life history characteristics, where it's their migration timing or how far they go, or their diet, like I was talking about for the whale. Sometimes they can show some flexibility here. And I think when we have included adaptive capacity in vulnerability assessments, we've seen that reduces our concerns about extinction risk. It reduces the number of organisms that we think are going to go extinct due to climate change. So this is one ray of hope that we are really, right, this article, Lindsay, I think just came out. The concept of adaptive capacity, folks have been talking about relatively recently. It's something that we do need to know a bit more about, and that will help inform where we direct our management efforts. And so with that, the second one is talking about climate adaptation. And again, it could spend the whole talk just talking about climate adaptation. And that's where we're taking strategic action, either in anticipation of what's going to happen or in response to what's happened, to address the effects or expected effects of climate change, right? So you don't have to necessarily sit and wait for changes. There are actions, some that resemble a lot of what you do, some that are really novel, to again, increase the likelihood of survival for organisms on the landscape and retain functioning ecosystems. So wanted to hit those 2 points home. And then with that, we'll close and open for questions.
Thanks, Olivia. That was great. Boy, you gave us a lot of things to think about, and so I'm seeing some clapping going on in the chat there. So there were a couple of questions that came up early on, and one response was just simply a definition, and that was, you mentioned earlier on neonatives or neonates. Can you tell us a little bit about how to define that?
Yes, so I think let's put aside the conversation about assisted migration. Generally, it's organisms that are shifting outside of the range that they have ever occupied. So historic range, so they're shifting completely out of it, would be the simplistic way of thinking about describing.
Great. So then we have a question from Mark, and Mark says, with all the observed and projected changes to species, communities, and ecosystems, does this challenge us to redefine the classification of native communities?
Yes, and I see Tony Lynn just shared a paper on managing neonatives. Right, we've been tinkering in this arena for a long time. I think some folks are thinking more on function, and right, this is a new organism on the landscape, and does it offer a function that is a surrogate for others? And so can we think about it just as it's new to the landscape, but can it serve a purpose? So thinking about some invasive wetland species, maybe they add a little bit more stability and reduce erosion, and maybe that's important despite it being not a native species. So.
Okay, and we have, and so Lindsay is thinking about what are new areas of potential impacts to wildlife that we ought to be thinking about for the National Climate Assessment 5? What should
Yeah,
we be exploring there, since you clearly have been thinking ahead at these things?
yeah, it's a good question, Lindsay. I will say for the Midwest, we focused a little bit more on adaptation because that has not been covered as much. We also focused on extreme events a little bit more, so flash drought or flooding, heavy rainfall events. I know a little bit less about sort of the broader, and again, sometimes you're supposed to cover things that have not been covered as much. So we're also focusing on sort of loss of ice in winter conditions. And again, that's for the Midwest, but I don't know as much for the ecosystems chapter. And I saw someone said, not neonate, neonative.
Right. And by the way, so that was Lindsay Thurman, and Lindsay is going to be one of our speakers on December 13th, and she's going to be talking about
Lindsay
whether
can
you
answer her own question.
shift in place. Exactly, she knows, but it's a good set. So, all right. So here, there's more coming in. So, have we learned anything about? This is Eric. Have we learned anything about climate change through the microclimate changes as shown by, going back to Darwin on Galapagos? Can we connect the dots all the way back there for these microclimate changes versus, the big macro changes that we're seeing?
I'm not quite sure where you want to go with the question, Eric. Maybe just while I'm talking, if you can add a little bit more. In terms of, do we see effects of microclimate on organisms? Yes. So like everything from, one of the examples I like is Carter blue butterfly and lupin, and the quality of lupin varies depending on microclimate and its availability if they get a second phase off. And so that's really important consideration. I mean, there's been work that's been done in the Caribbean on microclimate and evolution and reptiles, but not quite sure where you're going with the question.
Yeah, so we'll look to see if Eric clarifies that in a bit. And so Stephen asks, so again, we have researchers, we have managers that are part of this audience, and this is really a management question. Given the lack of species-specific ecological information in the face of ongoing range shifts, what parameters should we be looking at to drive our conservation action? So how do we plan for this stuff, and how do we make management decisions in the face of this constant change?
Yes, and we are on the science side, so we can't tell you exactly what to do because it depends on sort of your general decision context. But there is information, right, on vulnerability of species and habitats. There is also information on like management practices that you can implement, and you can go through a decision process of deciding, be it scenario planning or any other decision process, to say, okay, here's how much money I'm willing to spend. Here's how important it is relative to this conservation goal. Here's how likely we are to win this battle, and make your decisions based on that information. To some extent, I don't think it is much different than a lot of the other conservation challenges we have, where we are also making decisions with limited information and then just revising those decisions as we get additional. So you can focus on population level work, or you can focus on landscape level work, Stephen.
Right, and so this is a question from Sally, and again, many of these questions are really on the habitat side of things, and some and not as much on the organistic. But so we are seeing a rapid expansion of invasive pests, devastating certain tree species, fundamentally changing the forest composition. What do you think this will mean for wildlife and ecosystem diversity and stability over time? And you had a couple graphics that kind of showed individual looks at that, but that's so. What do you think, Olivia?
I think that's an area of work. I mean, I know we are now funding research in this arena. You know, a lot of times we focus on the impacts to forest productivity, but we don't necessarily look at then taking it one more step to the impacts on wildlife. And you know, folks are starting in that arena now, but we know sort of like we anticipate wide scale change. Right? And changing distribution and abundance of different species. Yep. It's a good question, I think.
Right. And we're seeing, you know, if you look at the climate change and, you know, tree atlas, for instance, we're seeing recommendations that oaks should do very well, for instance, under climate change. But yet we're having a great deal of difficulty regenerating those. There's just not regeneration in the forest because of invasives, because of browse problems. And so, you know, even though we think those species should do well, they may not. So that's another interesting consideration. Here's a question from Gabriel. And how can we plan ahead for the potential impacts of new invasive species? Again, for example, kudzu migrating northward. And of course, we have lots of examples of this kind of stuff.
Yeah, kudzu is one too, right? Normally limited by winter temperatures. Again, I think it's having a conversation. And again, there are folks working in this arena of where your time and money is best spent and where organisms might offer a functional role and where they might not, where they might really transform a system, and that there might need to be some triage that happens with management of invasive species. For disease dynamics, which are not the same but related, where we've done a little bit more work, is sort of, can we anticipate the next outbreak? And what's interesting is that we convened a group of folks, and really interesting to say, like, we think we are often going to be surprised by disease dynamics. I think invasive species, we should be a little bit less surprised. We should know, right? There's enough research and change in kudzu in the landscape that we should know it's expanding in the Midwest now, and that we should be preparing because we know it has such a transformative effect on ecosystems. So I think, Gabriel, it's going to be continued triage, but I think taking it up exponentially from what we have been doing. These are great questions.
Okay, and by the way, Eric, so Eric, back to the question on Galapagos, and you know, Eric was just saying he was just looking to see if our species on the edge of going extinct are actually changing their physiology, and we just haven't seen it yet. So that species may not necessarily be going extinct. That it may be more plastic than we realize.
Absolutely.
All right. So here we have one from Andrew. Hang on one second here. I feel like we're moving towards a paradigm shift in how we conceive of conservation, from preserving species and communities that have existed historically to adapting and responding to changes that to a large extent cannot be foreseen. And so he's simply asking, and again, you had a lot of slides that basically were making that point. So, so do you have some words that help us get our heads around this?
Yeah, I think going back and thinking about the paleo work, right? If you go back 1,000 years, 2,000 years, 10,000 years farther, the landscape was different than sort of where we defined pre-contact conditions, and that being sort of the gold standard. And even knowing that there was management of the landscape for millennia, even though, you know, we have this, again, definition of pre-contact as sort of being pristine. I think it's interesting, but I think that, yes, that this is something that we have to take a hard look at, is why we have created, you know, refuges and state parks that are anchored to particular communities, literally plant communities or particular species. Why that was done, that means that we, until those statutes are changed, we still have to manage for those conditions, for those plant communities, for those organisms. And so I think it is a conversation that we should have. And again, I think looking at the paleo community work the paleoecology, paleoclimatology work is helpful. And then again, I think thinking about sort of the origins of some of these concepts, be it transcendental movement, around that, and saying like, where did they come from, and are those causing more problems for us to be so static? So, no answers, just questions, Andrew, for me.
So Elise was also chiming in on Eric's question about Darwin, and in this case, she simply said, I think it's important to consider that even microclimates are shifting over time as climate change progresses. So, that's, and so do you have thoughts on that, Olivia? I mean, can we box that up?
Yeah, I mean, again, yes, you're seeing changes in wetland composition, right, which then alters microclimate. So yes, I mean, we are seeing shifts in both. And it's happening at a scale that, yeah, was unlike in Darwin's time. So the ability to evolve in such short times is really going to go against things with longer generation times, et cetera.
So so you've been able to cover most of the questions in the chat, but I just wanted to add, I mean, a number of these questions were along the theme of land managers trying to adapt to what they're seeing in front of them. So, not all of us are tuned in. So we had to bring in experts to help us with the series, right? And so we're not all our land managers out there may be aware of some of this research, but they can't follow it all. So do you have suggestions for us, for resource managers, for biologists, for foresters, to be able to find tools that we can use to help us understand the changes that are happening on lands that we're trying to manage, both at the landscape scale and at the site scale?
Yeah, I'll just speak to one product because it's a project that we didn't really going through, and it's on the adaptation arena, where we went through like 1,200 papers to say, what have we learned on adaptation for wildlife, and what's within the purview of an individual land manager. I can drop that in the chat if I can find the moment. And so that's really a summary. So expecting that no one can keep up with all of this literature, let alone someone who's actively working in it. So that's one. And then with it, we created the wildlife adaptation menu in partnership with NIAX to really say, here are the things you can do at the population level. Here are the things that you can do at the landscape level. It depends on sort of what your management goals are, what your site looks like, what are the changes relative to climate in your region, but then you can make those decisions and monitor those. So those are two resources if you're interested in improving the landscape or making better population decisions for wildlife that I would recommend. But there's a whole host of other things that folks can reach out to us as well.
So Olivia, a couple folks have asked about papers in the, so we would agree, if you had a short list of research you thought would kind of fit the theme of what we've talked about, we'd be glad to share them with the audience later. So you can share, and again, Tony Lynn, shared, about neonatives. So there's a number of things. So that might be a helpful list for people to get started on. And again, oftentimes we share answers to questions we didn't get to, but because you were so efficient in covering your material, we've been able to get to all the questions. So with that, I just want to really thank you for a really great presentation. I follow this stuff all the time, and you, that was really nice the way you covered that. And there's some things there that I didn't expect. So thank you so much for a great presentation.
Yeah, thank you.
And thanks to everyone who joined us. And again, please join us in a month, and we'll be talking about some of the synergistic effects of these impacts. Thanks to everyone. And again, big thanks to Olivia. And it's nice having an interpreter out there. So thank you, Beth.
Yes, thank you.